Hello everyone again, it's Stephanie Somerville from the AusIMM. I'd like to welcome everyone who is online today and thank everyone for registering for the first of two webinars on technical writing. This is the introduction to technical writing, and next week we will have the advanced skills in technical writing. Before we get things started, I would like to introduce Louise Correcha. Now, Louise is currently the Technical Writing Assistant at AMC Consultants and the Director of her own company, Red English. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Louise.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Welcome from wherever you're signing in from. I hope this introduction to technical writing today will be helpful for you. So my name is Louise. I work for AMC Consultants in Melbourne. I think that many of you might know AMC Consultants. So we've got offices all around the world, and I work in the Melbourne office. I also run my own business, Red English, which provides English language training services and also Spanish online courses. It started with English and has since expanded to Spanish with the help of my husband, who is a Spanish teacher. So without further ado, I'll begin today's session, which is an introduction to technical writing. Now, I'm aware that many of you are from different fields, so this webinar is not going to be too specific in terms of the vocabulary and abbreviations and things that you would be familiar with in your particular field, but it's more general principles that you should be applying to technical writing to make it effective. And I hope that some of the tips you might also find useful for applying to your writing in general and to business writing, because they are all principles of effective writing in general too. So I will just go ahead, and thank you again for joining. So today we're going to speak about what a technical writer is, firstly, and then we're going to talk about good technical writing. By good I mean effective. So we're going to talk about something called maximum communicative efficiency, which is quite funny because I tend to try to dissuade people from using long words like that in their writing, but I will explain what that means. So that's why I'm using those words and that term there. And I'm also going to talk about 5 main principles of effective technical writing, and they are ensuring that your writing is clear, consistent, concise, grammatically correct, and well structured. So there are a few tips for each of those areas that I'm going to run through. Of course, things like being grammatically correct, well, that's quite a big area. So we won't be going into, don't worry, we won't be going into the whole grammar of English and everything else today, but I'll just be highlighting some of the main errors that I tend to see cropping up in technical writing. And by talking about errors, I'm not talking about, being correct for the sake of being correct, as if I'm a teacher going to tell you off for, for an incorrect verb or adjective, but more in the sense of being correct so that we don't cause difficulty for the reader and we don't cause the reader to interpret something other than what we're intending to convey. Okay, so I'll go ahead and I'll just define technical writing first, and then we'll talk about some of those areas of good technical writing. So first of all, the definition of a technical writer. Well, there are 2 main definitions. The first is someone who writes technical and software manuals, handbooks and user guides. And we could also perhaps include procedures such as mining or mine site procedures within that definition as well. And the second is someone who writes for a specialised area, usually in science or industry. So that would be us as well, or people attending this webinar, I would think. Sometimes our writing in the mining sector in particular can cross the boundaries between scientific and technical writing, and you can actually study scientific writing as a whole other area as well, but today's is focused on technical writing. So the one thing that I'd like to point out is that technical writing is a form of factual writing. So it's good to try to distinguish those different types of writing. It's not fiction, poetry, or marketing spin. So, it's just about conveying factual information. So we don't need to be using elaborate adjectives and varying our vocabulary and trying to be convincing and persuasive generally in technical writing. It's just, conveying the facts in a clear way, and for business and technical personnel who need to find the information that they need quickly and not have any barriers to being able to understand what is required of them. This picture is one that I came across, which I found quite interesting, which is Calvin, of Calvin and Hobbes. And as you see, the quotation reads, "As my artist's statement explains, my work is utterly incomprehensible and is therefore full of deep significance." Now, I just draw that to your attention because it's just one thing for us to keep in mind. When we write in technical writing and factual writing, we're aiming to really write in a clear, concise way whereby people can understand what we're talking about. And our choice of words and structures will vary depending on who we think is going to be reading the document that we're writing. So we always keep that in mind. But we're not writing in a way that we should try to confuse or impress people. So yeah, I just thought that rang true to some of the things that I tend to read in different fields, and I just wanted to draw your attention to that. So I guess the guiding principle is to try to keep it simple as much as we can. Obviously with vocabulary we're going to be often quite complex depending on the subject matter. Like in geology you can't avoid using all your geological terms, but you can keep the structure of the sentences and the paragraph and the document overall logical and clear and well constructed so as to help the reader regardless of whether they're an expert in geology or not. So I'm going to focus on clarity, precision and relevance as the most important parts of technical writing, or the principles. So I learned in one particular course on technical writing about this concept of maximum communicative efficiency. So that is, we're being efficient as we can when we're communicating. So clarity, precision and relevance are the hallmarks of maximally effective technical communication. So that was just a nice little quote that I got from an article by Geoffrey Marnell, who's a technical writing expert here in Melbourne, who also delivered some training at Melbourne University. So I actually recommend reading some of his articles that are available online too, because he's great, a great leader in this field. So with that in mind, we can look at 5 main areas of good or effective technical writing. So we can talk about it being clear, consistent, concise, grammatically correct and well structured. So first of all, clear. By that I mean that we should try to use language that the reader will understand. We always think, who's reading this? Who is it for? We should be wary of ambiguity and vague language. So in the words that we choose, let's make sure that we're communicating what we intend to communicate, and someone's not going to misinterpret that or be confused by what we're saying. So it's consistent also, so we should use terms consistently. Now this is particularly important in technical writing, especially if you're doing manuals and procedures, because if you don't choose terms consistently and you choose another term to mean, or you choose 2 terms for one particular thing, you run the risk of confusing your reader, or somehow inconveniencing them, because they might just for a moment have to think, does that mean the same thing, or is he talking about something else, or is she bringing up a new point? So we've got to be consistent so as not to confuse our readers, and especially in manuals and procedures it's very important. we should try to be concise in writing. So if we look at it in terms of time, well, it's possibly our most valued resource in this world for most of us. We always want more time. So let's think about respecting people's time with concise writing. So that doesn't mean being so concise that we cut out important information. It's just, are there things that we could cut out from our sentences? Is there redundancy, or just things that we're putting in to perhaps pad, maybe remembering back to, you know, writing an essay at uni and having to work to a word limit or something like that. We need to try to be more concise generally in our writing, and that helps respect our reader. Most people can see through waffle and they don't really appreciate it in business. Then we're going to talk about being grammatically correct, because errors can distract the reader and make a sloppy impression. So it's not being correct for the sake of being correct, it's just let's not distract our reader or give a sloppy impression of ourselves or of our company. So if we say that we are experts and we have great attention to detail, it's probably not the best if something that we write has quite a few errors, because that's going to maybe subconsciously impact upon the reader, even though perhaps we think it shouldn't. That might be happening. So let's do our best to be grammatically correct. And of course, for some of us, it's been a long time since we've really reviewed grammar and writing, but I encourage you, if you are not sure, to just refresh your knowledge of English grammar and sentence structure. It can be really helpful. It's not as scary as what it might have been in school. So yeah, let's be grammatically correct as much as we can. And remember also that if we make an error, sometimes it can actually change our intended meaning. So we might select the incorrect of two possible words that sound like each other, and thereby change our meaning. So you'll see an example later in this webinar of someone using illicit with an I when they meant illicit with an E, and thereby changing the meaning from to draw out information to illegal, which was the meaning of illicit with I. So I hope I'm not losing you there. And lastly, we should look at it being well structured. I will cover this in more detail in next week's webinar, but for now I'm going to give you a little checklist that you can use at the end of having written a document, so you can guide the reader with a logical structure. Often just headings, breaking up the text will really help with the readability of it. So let's talk about being clear. I would like to communicate to you that it is important to use language that the reader will understand. Let's try and remove ambiguity when we can, and remove vagueness. So often it's difficult to identify those things when we're experts and we're so deep into our writing on a particular subject. It's sometimes difficult to step back and see that a sentence could be read a different way by a non-expert. So hopefully some of these tips will help you to recognise those things, so that your writing can be as effective as it can be. I mean, as you want it to be, or maximally efficient. So let's talk about using language that your reader will understand. So this is a good point. Even if you're writing for your peers, you've still got to present the information in a way that's easy to understand. A badly written document will be incomprehensible or misleading, no matter how knowledgeable your audience. So I often hear people saying, well, they'll know what I mean. They think it's about the vocabulary that I've highlighted, that perhaps something isn't very readable. They think sometimes people might think that it's about the vocabulary or the specialised vocabulary, when often it's not about that. It's about the actual structure and the logic of ideas. So I think that you will agree, when you see some of the best writers, you will see that they employ many techniques of efficient writing and plain English and so on in their writing. So basically, in a really nice way, I'm trying to say it's not an excuse to just think that because your audience is at the same technical level, that means that you shouldn't pay attention to structuring it in a way that it will be easier to understand. Because again, you're trying to save people time, make sure they're not inconvenienced by having to wade through difficult writing, especially important for peer reviewers and so on. So jargon is one area that comes up. Jargon being the specialised terms or vocabulary that we use in a particular profession, and so these might be acronyms and particular words that we might use that will be comprehensible to our colleagues. So jargon has got a bit of a negative rap, but it's not negative. It just refers to something that you would use when you're speaking with your colleagues to save time. But you need to think about, when you're writing a report, just step back a little bit and think, well, do I need to use that, or could I use it? Could I use a different term that will make sure that my writing is accessible to any professional within this field who picks it up and reads it? So I was giving the example before that as an English teacher or as a trainer, I could comfortably talk with my colleagues using gerund and past participle and verb and adjective. But if I do the same thing when I'm training a room full of IT, help desk support staff or engineers, sometimes I get blank looks, or I would if I used those words without defining them. I sat in a training session with some IT professionals, and the amount of jargon and abbreviations that they used, I had to keep interrupting and saying, sorry, what does that mean? What does that mean? So it's really about considering your audience, and if you have to use some jargon, considering whether you might define what that means quickly for people. So for example, in situ is something that we would use in mining quite often, but if we're writing for a more general audience, we should be thinking, do we need to define this the first time? So just be aware of it. And the guiding principle is to not use jargon if it obscures rather than clarifies meaning. So remember, we're trying to communicate, make sure that people understand what we're saying. Yeah, I hope that that's an overview for you. Of course, there are so many different examples of jargon depending on exactly what your field is, so I'm happy to accept questions about that and get back to you. So we're using language that the reader will understand, and then we'll also try to remove ambiguity. So that means, ambiguity is when there's two or more potential interpretations of something. So there are, lots of words in English that have two or more meanings, and if English is not your first language, you'll be even more familiar with this. So let's try to be aware of that and remove any potential ambiguity for people to make sure that our meaning is crystal clear. So two examples or two ways I'm going to show you are through punctuation and effective punctuation, and through avoiding some ambiguous words. There are other types of ambiguity. Those are the ones we'll focus on today. Before we do that, we're just going to run a little poll on punctuation. So I'm going to show you, going to just launch the first poll now. So this question, this poll, is asking you to answer which of the following sentences do you think is correctly punctuated. So firstly, the first one is earlier in 1989 a law was passed. The second is earlier in 1989 a law was passed. And the third option is both of the above. So I'll just give you a little bit of time to think about that and to answer. Okay, so we'll stop that now. Thank you to everyone who voted. So I can see, thankfully, that the majority of you chose option C, or the third option, which is both of the above. So thank you very much for that. The reason that both of the above is correct is, so from those examples we can see there was earlier in 1989 a law was passed, or earlier in 1989 a law was passed. Both of those are actually punctuated correctly, it just depends what you want to say. So that's where little things like commas can really change the meaning of what you're intending to say. So, you know, within the context of a sentence or a paragraph about a larger period of time, someone might have a sentence that says, earlier in 1989 a law was passed. So maybe, you know, comparing that with 1995 or something. Earlier in 1989 a law was passed. The second, earlier in 1989 a law was passed. So the person was probably talking about just 1989 before they wrote that sentence. They were talking about all the things that happened in 1989. And then they said earlier in 1989, so in January as opposed to August. So there is a slight difference there. Both of them are correct. So neither is incorrect or correct. And when people ask me about punctuation, they ask, is this correct? I will often say it depends what you want to say, because where you put a comma or where you put a hyphen can change the meaning. So thank you again to everyone who voted on that. Yeah, and there are other aspects of that we could delve into more deeply if we did a workshop on punctuation, which is always a lot of fun. But yeah, that's just a little example to highlight the possibility that many things are possible with punctuation. Here are some other fun examples that perhaps you've seen before. The first is, a woman without her man is nothing. Have you seen perhaps before this sentence punctuated in two different ways? It can create two completely different meanings. And the second one, eat grandpa, which was one that I saw very recently. So those words, you could punctuate them to mean very different things. So let's have a look at the next slide. So we have, a woman without her man is nothing. A woman without her man is nothing. So you can see the subtle difference there. Some of you might have read Eats, Shoots and Leaves by Lynn Truss, which is a great little book which covers the differences that punctuation can create in terms of meaning. And the second one I just saw recently, actually on Facebook, which was under the title of Punctuation Saves Lives. So there you go, eat grandpa, eat grandpa. Two different meanings there. So let's have a look at some more examples of how commas can change meaning in more business and technical examples that I've taken. So the first is, employees who work hard will get a bonus each year, or employees who work hard will get a bonus each year. Now hopefully you can see that there's a slightly different emphasis there. The first talks about only the employees who work hard are the ones that will be getting a bonus, and the second implies that all employees will get a bonus, and it gives us some extra information about something that they do. So it's employees will get a bonus. Employees who work hard will get a bonus each year. So I hope you can see that there's the second example is putting some information between commas, which actually means that it's parenthetic information or extra information, or perhaps a comment about the employees. But the main elements of the sentence are employees will get a bonus each year. This is about restrictive and non-restrictive clauses and relative and non-relative clauses, but I'm not going to go into all of that in this webinar. The second example is also showing how we can have two completely different meanings, and we have to be careful with the punctuation. The first is, the doctor whose wife was dead tired of the conversation. So that's extra information about the doctor, but we're going to then talk about the doctor. The second is, the doctor whose wife was dead tired of the conversation. So you can see that there are two very different meanings there. And here are some examples from more technical reports. The insects which were initially resistant to DDT all developed cancers. So just the insects that were initially resistant to DDT. The second example is implying that all the insects developed cancers, and we're giving some information that they were, and all of them, initially resistant to DDT. So it makes more sense when you read it out loud and pause where the commas are. So the insects, which were initially resistant to DDT, all developed cancers. Now this does bring up another point about which and that, which I'm unfortunately not going to cover today again because of time. But what we tend to also recommend in effective technical writing is perhaps considering the use of that instead of which in the first example, just to help really make sure that there's no misunderstanding. But anyway, what we can see is what is between the commas is usually extra information, like an aside, but the main elements of the sentence are the ones that you read on either side. I hope that that's clear, and you might have to go back and read some of them. The research findings which were likely to cause embarrassment were never circulated, or the research findings which were likely to cause embarrassment were never circulated. So you can see there's a slight difference in meaning there. The first is that the research findings were never circulated, and those findings were likely to cause embarrassment. That's the second. The first is that just those research findings which were likely to cause embarrassment were never circulated. I hope I didn't confuse you there. When you read it again, it should be clear, I hope. This third example I took from a report that I reviewed. It was the third example, so it didn't have any punctuation. It had, as the temperature rose further to the right went the needle. And as I read it, I then had to go back and think, I wonder where they intended to put that punctuation, what they actually meant. And you could say, well, it's pretty clear, but again, you're thinking, maybe it's clear to you, but let's use punctuation to make sure that it's totally clear to the reader. So as the temperature rose further to the right went the needle could be a possibility. So could as the temperature rose further to the right went the needle. Maybe it sounds a little bit unusual because we don't tend to write in that way in English anymore. But nevertheless, it did cause me to go back and have to read it again and ask the author what they intended to say. So I can't remember right now exactly what they intended to say, but that's just an example of where you might need to clarify the meaning. So commas are one area that people often misuse or are not quite sure how to use them correctly. And again, like I mentioned, it's easy these days just to jump online and refresh your knowledge of effective comma use. The second is with hyphens, and especially with hyphenating what we call compound adjectives. So those are maybe two or more words together which describe another word. And the use of hyphens really helps to clarify the meaning, make sure that what we're saying is what we're intending to say and what people will understand. So the first, if you look at this example, he is an English dictionary salesperson. It might seem straightforward, but if you read it again, you'll see that there's two possible interpretations. He's a dictionary salesperson who happens to be English in nationality, or he's a salesperson who sells English dictionaries. So our little hyphen, we can put it in to join the words that go together to describe the other thing, so we make our meaning crystal clear. So in the second, he is an English dictionary salesperson. That hyphen serves to tell us that he is a salesperson of English dictionaries. Those things go together. That's the purpose of the hyphen in the compound adjective. So here's another example. He owns a small animal farm. So we could ask, is that a farm that sells small animals or that has small animals? Or is it an animal farm that is small? So again, hyphens help us to clarify that. He owns a small animal farm. Small and animal go together, so it is a farm of small animals. I don't know what sort of animals, but that's an example that hopefully shows that clear distinction there. This third example I actually got from a report, and the engineer was talking about a mine needing 6-metre long planks, and I just started in this sector, so I wasn't aware of the usual lengths of planks or anything. So this is an example of me not being an expert and just coming in and saying, hang on, that could be read 2 different ways, and so having to clarify that meaning with the author. So did that person mean 6-metre long planks, 6 planks that were each 1 metre long, or 6-metre long planks, so planks that were each 6 metres long? So you see the difference there. What you put together as one thing helps us to understand what you mean. You mean metre-long planks or 6-metre-long planks? The same with this example. So we froze the 60-year-old specimens. We could say, do you mean you froze the 60-year-old specimens? So 60 specimens that were each 1 year old? And perhaps maybe not in this example, but nevertheless it does show us how there are 2 possible interpretations. So you mean 60 specimens that are each a year old, or do you mean 60-year-old specimens? So there should actually be a hyphen between 60 and year in that second example, if anyone is really paying attention to me there, and I do apologise for that. Of course it should be that those 3 60-year-old are joined with a hyphen in order to make it clear that the specimens are each 60 years old. So I apologise for that. I'll have to get the proofreader to proofread my proofread work. So another example that I picked up recently was we studied the effects of small wave modulation. Most people know that small waves are things that are studied, so that's fine. People might understand that, but nevertheless, to be clear, let's put the small and the wave together to show what we're talking about, modulation of small waves. So we studied the effects of small wave modulation. By the way, I just wanted to highlight that notice that we studied the effects with an E. So another comment, just a little one that people often confuse is effects with an E and effects with an A. And so generally when we're talking about things like special effects, we use the effects with an E. And when we're using a verb, something that affected something else, we use the A, the one with the A. That's the difference in English. There is another small usage of effect with an E as a verb, but it's very particular and it's only in one particular usage. This is 99% of the time. So if you have a look at those examples, you would say it had no effect on the results with an E. But when we're just using a verb and we're talking about what it did, we say it did not affect the results. See that? An effect, but it did not affect with an A. The difficulty comes about because of English pronunciation rules and that we don't actually audibly pronounce those 2 differently because we stress the second syllable. So we say effect, effect. Depending on where you're from though, that might differ slightly, but yeah, that's the difference grammatically. And I'll highlight that again in some later common examples of errors. So now, so we've talked about punctuation and using commas and hyphens to try to make sure that our meaning is clear. And another little tip I'll give you is to try to avoid ambiguous words. So again, ambiguity where there's at least 2 possible interpretations. You should be aware that words like as, while and may are potentially ambiguous to the reader, especially if the document is for an international audience or if it will be translated. Because there's at least 2 meanings to each of those words and we tend to use them without thinking about the fact that there is. So let's try to use words that just have 1 meaning so we don't confuse our readers. If I'm going to translate that into Spanish, or if I'm translating from Spanish, probably if I'm translating from English to Spanish, I would have to ask, the translator would have to ask, what do they mean by while? Do they mean at the same time as, or do they mean although? And by may, do they mean can, or they're giving me permission? So what we should try to do, for example, is to avoid using as to mean because, which is a really common thing. So in this example, use the active voice as it's easier to translate. Try not to use as, try to use because. As can be confusing, it can mean at the same time as. Let's try to avoid using while when we mean although. So this is really common. While option A is more expensive, ABC recommends we should try to use although. Because when you use while, the person might start reading thinking at that time. So if you choose because and although, then your meaning is clear. Notice that I used another example of as and because in that sentence as well. And then third, be careful with may. Try to use must or can instead, if you can. So because ABC may change these terms, do you mean that they are allowed to or that they might? So try to use words that are really clear, unless you're being intentionally vague. So speaking of vagueness, we're going to have a quick look at our second poll. Okay, so I'd appreciate if you'd like to join in and vote again on this one. So the question is, who is keen? ABC has approached BCA with an offer. It appears to be very keen. So thank you to all of you who are voting. So we need to be aware that while we're writing and we're sure what we mean, we know who's keen. Let's read it again, stepping outside and just thinking, is this really clear to everyone who picks this up and reads it? So using that example, you can see it actually as the second example that I've got there on the slide. ABC has approached BCA with an offer, so I'll just go straight to that one. It appears very keen. Who? If you go down to the second tip, underneath tips there, you can see what you could try to do to make it clearer is to replace it with the relevant name or object if possible. So you would change it to ABC or BCA as relevant. So that's a really easy tip. So ABC has approached BCA with an offer. BCA appears very keen. Yeah, it might be that we could get that it's BCA, but it's better just to be clear. And another example, which is the first there, is it, but you can also get that vagueness with this. So the next recommendation is to clarify the reward structure. This is required to maintain motivation. So in really clear writing, we should look at our this and think, is that actually clear what we mean? If not, a little tip is to try to develop the habit of following this with a summarised version of what you're referring to. So I do this all the time in writing. It just helps the reader follow exactly what you're talking about. So depending on the intended meaning of this in the first example, the next recommendation is to clarify the reward structure. This recommendation, this clarification, or this reward structure is required to maintain motivation. Again, so just, it's not a rule, it's just something that you can, sometimes this is really clear. I know that in this presentation I use many instances of this, but I've chosen that in those instances they're clear enough to you. So it's just about considering your this and it and making sure it's clear and not vague to the reader. So, so we've talked about being clear. Now, talking about being consistent, what I mean is that you should just always try to use consistent words. Try not to vary them too much. For one word, one concept. So if a reader's presented with two terms for one unfamiliar thing to them, they might think you're referring to two things. So that can confuse them, which gets in the way of effective communication. So I might just skip, just because of time, I'm going to go to the second and third examples on that page. So this was from a software manual. Insert the USB into the port and then later on insert the USB into the jack. For an uninformed reader, those things might mean the same to the person writing this manual, but it could confuse the person reading that because they're going to stop and say, oh, jack, hang on, I know where the port is, where's the jack? Then they might have to Google and find out that they're the same thing, but that would be avoided if you just chose one or the other, port or jack, and stuck to it throughout a document. So that's really important in technical writing. And again, this is from a software manual as well. So click on the tool ribbon and then later on now click on the toolbar. Again, that might confuse people. We're talking about two different things. Ah, I found the ribbon, where's the bar? So just be aware of your vocabulary choice. Just very quickly, that first one, it was talking about inferred mineral resource, and then later on it talked about inferred resource. Now, we might decide, oh, that's pretty clear that it's the same, but remember, someone who's not an expert might just stop for a minute and say, okay, we're talking about different things here. So make sure that you choose your term and stick to it. Especially in multi-author documents, you should really, when you peer review or when someone proofreads, they should be looking for those sorts of things. Make sure that it's clear throughout and consistent. Again, this can happen not just with little like nouns, with the words, but also with the verbs that we choose. So what's happening? The code is allocated by the system, and then later on, after it is assigned, a careful reader might say, are they talking about the same thing, or do I need to go back? Did I miss the bit about assigning? Okay, and again, things like the report, the study. I know that we are encouraged in our earlier training in writing to vary our vocabulary, but in technical writing we're aiming for being maximally efficient in our communication, making sure we don't confuse the reader in any way. So if we're going to talk about it being a report, let's talk about it being a report the whole way through, or the study. Now I know that there are different examples when that might have to change, but in general this is the principle. The third example was one that I saw recently as well, and it talked about a positive linear relationship being observed. And then later on in another sentence it talked about two populations where the linear trend was observed. And as a careful reader I thought, the linear trend, are they still talking about the positive linear relationship? So, just to avoid your reader thinking that or worrying about it, which is getting in the way of what you're trying to communicate, your point, just stick to the same thing. You might not have to use all the same words every time, but for example, in that second sentence, I would have said figure 4 shows two populations where that linear relationship or the positive linear relationship was observed. So just choosing your words carefully, I guess, being careful in reading. Also, we should try to be concise. So I talked about that a little bit at the beginning, and I'll go through quickly some ways that you can be more concise. And the first is to convert nominalizations, which again, that's jargon. It's talking about nouns that are descriptions of verbs. So it's things like demonstration, consideration, reduction, preparation. We should convert those into strong verbs. So instead of this is a demonstration of, we can just say this demonstrates. In consideration of, considering. This is an adherence to, this adheres to. This provides proof of, this proves. This causes a reduction in, this reduces, and so on, we prepared for. And I see very often they made the decision to, they decided to. So you can see how being concise is not, some people think that it's kind of dumbing down their writing or something like that. No, it's not. It's just making it more concise, more crisp and sharp. We should also try to remove redundancy, which means redundant words, words that are already saying, or they're already saying what another word next to it is saying, so it's redundant, it's not necessary. For example, brief summary, I don't know how often you have a really long summary. Forward planning, when do you plan for the past? So necessary prerequisite, is there an unnecessary prerequisite? And previous experience, of course, you're just thinking that, okay, some words we can just cut out. Summary, planning, prerequisite, experience. This is not to say that it's right or wrong, it's just things that you can be aware of. And sometimes when you follow all these tips, you'll find that you have a really nice, concise, well-written sentence. And sometimes when you'll read the writing of people who write really well, you'll think, how do they do that? And it's because they're paying attention to these little things. And another tip is if you can use a single word, which is very similar to the previous tip, use a single word rather than a group of words when you can. So rather than a large number of, can you use many, a reduced number of, fewer for the purposes of establishing? Can you just say to establish? In order to, can you just say to? Has the ability to, can. So this technique can assist the mind to, instead of has the ability to. So I'm sorry that I just flicked back there. Now, there is another thing that we can do that you may have heard people talking about in writing, which is to use the active voice unless there is a reason to use the passive. Again, I'm not going to go too much into exactly what active and passive is, other than to say at the bottom that the passive voice is when you have things like is contributed to by, are eaten, is seen. It's these longer constructions. And again, I can go into that further if you want more details about that. But for example, more than 6 million is contributed each year to the local community by ABC. You could change that to an active verb. Each year, ABC contributes more than 6 million. Just reduces the wordiness and it still says the same thing. So is contributed is passive, and when you use those sorts of constructions, you might also have to put in a by and the person who is doing that action. So if you just change it to put the person who's doing the action and then the verb after it, it becomes much more concise and readable, I think. So that's what they mean when they talk about using active. You talk about who does what rather than what is done, which is passive. So the third and last poll is about being grammatically correct. So we're just going to look at the third question, which is, which of the following is correct of these two possibilities? The first is the true extent of John's problems have been kept from us. And the second is the true extent of John's problems has been kept from us. It's a little bit of a tricky one. So we're voting again, everyone's voting, so thank you again. Thank you for being so enthusiastic about grammar. And it's looking good. Yes. So again, thank you. Everyone, well, not everyone, but the majority has selected the second. The true extent of John's problems has been kept from us. So that's really good. We're going to go on to looking at some examples of what that's about now. So some common areas of difficulty that I see in writing are, in terms of grammatical correctness, something that we call subject-verb agreement. So that means that what we're talking about, the subject, should it agree with the verb? So we choose the verb form according to whether the subject is singular or plural. I know it sounds a little bit gobbledygookish, so I hope that this presentation will be clear enough to go back and you can refresh or ask me if you're not sure. But so we have the car runs, but we have the cars run. And so we choose runs with car and we choose run with cars. This road is poor, these roads are poor. So we've selected our verb is or as according to what, whether the road is singular or plural. So that's cool, but what sometimes happens is when we write really long sentences, which we should try to avoid anyway, people can get really confused by the end of it and forget what the main noun is or what they were actually talking about, the main idea. And so in these sorts of long sentences, the form of the main noun determines our verb. So having a look here, one missile with several warheads performs better than, not perform. So people get influenced by the warheads being plural and they choose perform. But they've got to think, okay, we're talking about the missile. So one missile performs better than. And again, that example that was from the poll. So until now, the true extent of John's problems has been kept from us because we're talking about the extent. That extent has been kept from us. The fact that it's John's problems, plural, is not relevant to the overall structure, which is the true extent has been kept from us. And this is one that I saw in a report. So AMC's proprietary flow modelling of pace-fill estimates is summarised in these tables. Again, not are, because we're talking about the modelling, not the estimates themselves. So I hope that that's clear. Another thing that I see quite often in technical writing is overcapitalisation. We tend to have a tendency to think that any sort of important word needs to be capitalised, but we should stick to the rules because if we capitalise too many things, we can actually mislead the reader and start to make them think that this is the name of a particular thing. So what we need to do is stick to using our capital letters for the start of a sentence, the start of each word in a proper noun. So in that example, the Prominent Hill Copper Gold Project. And of course, in some of our fields, we have specific defined terms like all reserve that we have to use in capitals because that's dictated by the JORC code or something like that. So again, just think about whether your capital letter is really necessary. There's a whole session that I could do on that. I'd also like to just bring your attention to some commonly confused or misused words. Principle and principle is something that I see quite often, so make sure you know the difference between those two. So the principle with an A is like the first, so the principal reason, the main reason, or a principal engineer. And principle with Ali is an idea, so it's based on the principle of. Then effect and effect that I talked about before, so that affected me with an A and the effect of that with an E. Illicit versus illicit, which I alluded to at the beginning. Illicit is illegal and illicit means to draw out, so use the words correctly so as not to change your meaning. Compliment and compliment is something that I also see quite often. Compliment with an I is something nice, so she gave me a compliment. Think about nice with an I, compliment. And compliment is to go nicely with, so it was a perfect compliment to complements the music. Stationery and stationery, something also that I see quite often. Stationery with an E is the noun, so think about pen. So I went to the stationery aisle of the store. Stationery we would use probably more often in mining with an A, so the vehicle was stationary with an A. Now, okay, and I've also got their license and practice and practice. Now this is, you can actually look up in, like the Oxford Dictionary, and you can see what the difference is here. It tends to be just one of the difference between Australian and British and US English. So just think about the audience for what you are writing. So there's some slight differences there. In Australian and British English, we tend to use words with ICE for the actual thing, the noun, and ISE for the verb. So we say he has a license to drive with a C and in practice with a C. And I think ice is a thing, so that's how I remember it. And then when we're talking about the verb, we use the S, so he's licensed to drive and he practiced every day. Funnily enough, in US English, it doesn't quite follow such a logical rule, and they tend to use practice with a C for both uses, the verb and the noun. So they would say in practice, he practiced, both with a C, and license with an S for both. So he has a license with an S and he's licensed with an S. So again, depends on who your audience is. And I'll just very quickly go through it's, there, and your. In technical writing and informal writing, you actually should avoid contractions, which are those forms like IT apostrophe S or there with the apostrophe or your, because in formal writing we shouldn't actually use those contracted forms. But nevertheless, I see these still coming up as errors in technical writing and in reports and in emails, because people might put an apostrophe when they don't mean to, for it's, for example. So it's without apostrophe is a possessive, his or her, so this is a very common error. He understood its function. You don't need an apostrophe. Its function is this. It with an apostrophe is it is or it has, depending on context. It's a lovely day, it is a lovely day, it's been great means it has been great. And there, so there is a possessive, he understood their language, T-H-E-I-R. There with an apostrophe is they are interested, they're interested. And there is a location or an existential there, we call it in English grammar. So it's over there, and there are 9 types. And your and your. Your is a possessive adjective like his, her, its, or their, so he understands your point. And your is you are. You're interested in learning his language. Okay, and I'm just going to finish here with just that checklist that I said at the beginning that I would give you, but I'm going to go through these principles more in next week's webinar. So when you've assembled all the information that you think your readers will need when you're writing, review what you've written, consider clarity, consistency and accuracy, and then consider structure. And you could ask yourself all of these questions about whether your headings are necessary and if they follow in a logical sequence and whether they accurately describe the text that follows them. And I don't think I need to read them all out because you'll have those on record. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for that, Louise. Thank you everyone for coming online today. We're just going to have a look at some of the questions to see if there's any that Louise can answer at the moment.
Okay. So I see one of the questions here was about exploration license. So I hope that my example about the use of license might help there. Now that's my general understanding. I don't know if there's something particular that's related to a code that we have to think about, whether it's perhaps a code in Australia or a code in Canada. So it depends on the context of exploration license and what code we're referring to. But I would use exploration license with a C because it's the thing, it's the license. But again, I'd ask who is the audience. I hope that makes sense. Another question which comes up quite often is about using data. Now this is a really common question. When using data, should we use the data shows or the data show? This is changing. The use of this is changing. So technically, we probably, maybe most of us learnt that data is the plural form. So it should really be the data show because the singular of data is datum. So technically we should be saying the data show because data is a plural. But because so few people these days know that there's a difference between datum as the singular and data as the plural, we start to have a debate about what is correct. And so now it really depends on what is common use in your particular field. I'm sorry that I can't be clearer. It should be the data show. I stick to that, following sort of the rules of knowing that that's a plural form, but I know that it's becoming increasingly common to accept the data shows because we think of the data as one thing. So I would say in those instances it's really good if you have a style guide or perhaps your organisation might have a style guide that everyone can be aware of so that they all choose one form over the other consistently. So I had one more interesting question. Well, all of them are interesting, but out of colour and colour, C-O-L-O-U-R or C-O-L-O-R, which word is globally accepted? Again, I guess there's no real, I don't think there's such a thing as globally accepted. It depends on what variety of English is being used by the audience. So you probably know that colour with a U tends to be more British and Australian use, and colour without the U tends to be American use. So it really depends on your audience. And again, these sorts of questions can be answered in an organisation's style guide. At AMC, for example, we decide if this is going to be international English or Australian English or British English. So we are particular in that, and we use the Oxford English Dictionary and we choose international English and we go with that. So everyone knows to go with that. So we have that referenced, to go with. Hope that's clear.
Wonderful. I think we might stop there. I'd like to again thank everyone who has come online and viewed the webinar today. Hopefully you will all catch the second webinar next Monday on the advanced skills of technical writing, also presented by Louise. I'd like to thank Louise for presenting today. I know that I have learned something, and hopefully everyone else has learned something. So we're going to end the webinar. Thank you very much everyone again for coming on, and those who have answered questions and participated in the polls.
Thank you to everyone for joining. Thank you.
Bye.